Hey everybody, it's Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast, and there for a while I was younger, I had a style of video game that I like to waste my time on. And in this video game, time just moves. It moves, they call it a real-time strategy game, RTS for the fancy types. And time, it just keeps moving. You can't really pause it. I mean, maybe you can pause it, but the idea is that you got to think on your feet and you've got to manage this whole little world that you're building. And you usually start from scratch in a real-time strategy game, right? You're just some settler out in the woods and you pick a good spot and you say, build a town here. And then you build a town. And then the machine is like, you got to get some wood and some rocks to keep building things. And you're going to need gold. Then wolves attacked. You're going to need a guy with a spear. And so you got to hustle all over the place and get all the little resources. And what I liked about that style of game, no. Let me start with what I didn't like about that style of game. It was a total waste of my time and way too immersive. And I would burn hours on hours of time as a young man that I could have been doing probably more productive things. But what I liked about those kind of games was being forced to think about the unsexy part of building a civilization. The unsexy part is, of course, resource management and logistics and having enough stuff to sustain the things you already built, and budgeting and planning. It's not interesting. What's interesting is getting a whole bunch of people with swords and then lining them up on your little fake computer battlefield and then fighting a whole bunch of other people with swords. Whoever wins gets all the gold. That's fun. But for the most part, that isn't how empires are built. For the most part, great civilizations are built more in the style of this mundane, boring style of video game, where very little of it is flashy, military, interesting stuff, and most of it's just logistics, management, getting resources, stuff like that. That's what we're getting here in Nehemiah chapter 10. You know what's real fun and interesting and sexy in Nehemiah? When all the people are like, we're going to come and kill you while you try to build your wall, and it's a race against time. And if they can't build the wall quickly enough, the bad guys are going to overrun them and get them. So we got to have the sword in one hand and a trowel in the other, and we got to take shifts building, and then we got to change into our armor and hold a spear to fend off the savages who want to kill. Like, that's good, juicy, interesting stuff. This is the not sexy part where we figure out how we're going to pay to keep the new city that we just walled in afloat and running. But interestingly, this not sexy part is really the thing that makes this all last. It's the thing that makes it all work. It's the thing that keeps it from being a flash in the pan where some ancient people group, most of whom we just completely forget about and who are lost to history, built a little thing and they had a good day and they had a religious ceremony or something, and then they got conquered and just engulfed by the pages of history and we never heard from them again. The difference between that and the story of the stuff in the Bible and the way this lingers all the way into the modern world, I think is what we're looking at right here in Nehemiah 10. This place where the descendants of Abraham come together and they ratify the covenant and commit themselves and their kids' kids to this thing. There's no car chases, there's no explosions, no lasers, there's no stabbing, but this is where the rubber meets the road. This right here, if Nehemiah 10 doesn't happen, I think maybe this people group just gets absorbed into history. It doesn't go perfectly. In the end, they find new problems to have, just like all people find new problems to have. Every time we solve something, we think of another way to struggle. It's human nature, I guess. But it doesn't diminish the win that this is. And even if you set aside all religious things and just look at this from the perspective of longevity and management and winning the real-time strategy video game of history as a people group, this is a pivotal moment. And we've been talking about the funding portion of this renewal of the covenant. And the last couple times around, we've been looking at this temple tax, an ancient tradition, an ancient command of God even, dating all the way back to the time of the Exodus, 800 or 1,000 years before the events of the 5th century that we're looking at here in Nehemiah chapter 10. We looked at the resuscitation, the resurrection of this old tax, even if it was at a slightly reduced rate to accommodate for the economic realities of the moment. But there's more resource management that needs to happen in order to make all of this go. And that's what we're going to get next as we continue to go through the ratification of this covenant and the terms therein. Nehemiah 10:34. We, the priests, the Levites, and the people have cast lots to determine when each of our families is to bring to the house of our God at set times each year a contribution of wood to burn on the altar of the Lord our God, as it is written in the law. So this is basically the part of the covenant that it's very similar to the one that you made as parents when you signed your kid up for Little League, or that your parents made for you when they signed you up for Little League. Y'all made a covenant together, whether you called it that or not, for everybody to bring Capri Suns for after the game, and you put together a little schedule. You're like, oh, all right, the Johnsons have it on the 11th, and then the Jorgensens on the 13th, and then the Jacksons on the 12th. Why do they all have J names? What am I even doing right now? Whatever, they all have J names on this baseball team, and they're all going to bring Capri Suns on their appointed day. This is why we can have nice things like Little League Baseball. Same deal here, except it's just the resources that they go out in the world in their real-time strategy game and harvest, chop, 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 chop wood. And then the little guy comes back over all pixelated with the armful of wood and deposits it in the wood building, and your wood count goes up. But then when it comes your time each year, your little family has to go from the wood hut over to the temple and drop off your contribution of wood on the Capri Sun wood schedule. That was like 9 metaphors all in one thing. I loved it. Nehemiah 10:34. Here's the next provision for how we're going to make things work economically. Quote, "We also assume responsibility for bringing to the house of the Lord each year the first fruits of our crops and of every fruit tree." Okay, well, in the real-time strategy games I used to play, you had to get wheat or some kind of food provision to make your army and your different working class people go. And so you had to have so many little green tiles where they're growing like wheat or fruit or whatever. Maybe you could have fish. Sometimes there were fish tiles just off the coast, and you could put a little boat on that. And then the little workers go to work, and they harvest the field, and they fish, and they reel in the fish. That was supposed to be a reeling in a fish sound. It didn't work very well. I'm a fly fisherman. My fishing sounds different than your fishing. And then they bring their little fish, and they bring their little bread, and they put it in the food store. And then every month, it goes down a little bit, but you try to keep constantly building that up. Well, once a year, your little men from each of your household are going to have to walk over with your pixelated crops and fruit, and you're going to have to give it to the people who are over at the temple building and increase their supply so that they can keep doing all of the priestly things that are required to make this thing go. Next provision for how this is all going to work economically, verse 36. "As it is also written in the law, we will bring the firstborn of our sons and of our cattle, of our herds and of our flocks to the house of our God, to the priests ministering there." Now, that last part sounds pretty weird. It sounds like the expectation is that everybody's supposed to donate their firstborn to the service of the Lord. And, well, it is going to sound pretty weird. To modern ears, we don't do that. We choose our own path in life. We are very independently minded. When young adult novelists imagine a dystopian future, it always involves some sort of sorting ceremony where all of the young adults are directed based on aptitude into some sort of apprenticeship program, and their future is just decided for them. But really, for most of human history, that's been a fairly common practice. And in the Old Testament, though it is very different from how we do things now, there are provisions for people's firstborn being offered not in sacrifice. Good heavens, is the Bible ever absolutely overt in forbidding child sacrifice? I mean, it's just absolutely a no-go in every way. We're not talking about that at all here. The original audience would have understood it, and indeed, if you go through and read the Old Testament, you will come away understanding it as rather vocationally, your firstborn, unless you choose to buy them back from service to the temple, is going to live out some kind of priestly life or going to participate in the religious life of the community in service to the temple. Remember, this is the job of highest honor in this society. This is a job that is obviously, as we're looking at right now, very well provided for. This is not some kind of torturous thing that was inflicted on people, but the idea was every family is going to make contributions from their own family. Everybody's going to have family members who are involved in the religious life of things professionally, if you will. Now, in Exodus 13, Exodus 34, and Numbers 18, which are three of the passages that deal with this from, again, 800 or 1,000 years before the events we're looking at in Nehemiah chapter 10, there is a provision there that for, I believe the number is 5 shekels, so for the equivalent of a few years' worth of temple tax, you could basically buy back your firstborn son from service in the temple and have him work in the service of your household like the rest of your kids would. But some people obviously would say, well, no, why would we want to do that? We have plenty of people to work in the household, and there will be plenty of people to inherit the household. We're going to consecrate this child to this particular vocation. It's not like at that point they got taken away to like the Jedi temple or something and had to renounce all associations. It wasn't that kind of a deal at all. People were still a part of a family, and their names were still connected to all of their family name. But there was a provision built into the expectations of this society from God. That's how the Bible holds it out, that the firstborn of everything, livestock and even people, sons, were to be consecrated to the Lord. I totally get this seems incredibly foreign to you and me, but these are different times. And there are different pressures acting upon this. Right now, we live in a moment in history where belief in God and Christianity are significantly on the rise globally. And even in the West, where those numbers have flagged for the last 20 years, just in the last year, across all generational demographics, we're seeing the first uptick in belief in God and Christian faith, even in the West, even in our country, in a really long time. But even though that is the case, we're still in a place where we do not have nearly enough people entering the priesthood or the pastorate to meet the needs of all of these people who are starting to discover historic Christian faith, who are starting to discover the values of the kingdom and what it is to be in relationship with God and all of this stuff that you and I are talking about and that you and I are in different places along our journey as we think through. So it can happen really quickly is the point. In less than one generation, if there isn't some really effective way to bring people into this role of religious service, of Christian service, you can find yourself over a barrel with just a lack of leadership and a lack of people to play this part, to perform this role. And this provision was meant to build in a system by which people would get a job that would provide and provide very well for a family, and that would involve them in a role of great honor in the community that was first and foremost offered to firstborn sons. So there you go. No car chases, no explosions, no lasers, no stabbings at all. But still, very, very important, mundane, practical, logistical considerations being addressed in this ratification of the covenant. And these things are brilliant, even though they're not, super, super exciting and thrilling. This is how you build something for the long haul. And that's what we're looking at here in Nehemiah 10. And that's why this stuff is such a big deal. And with that, we're done for today. I'm Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast. Let's do this again soon.